They say grief makes you do strange things. I always believed that phrase meant sobbing into old sweaters or talking to gravestones. But for me, grief meant packing up my entire life into two battered suitcases and moving in with my son. After my husband of 43 years passed away, the silence in our house became unbearable. The ticking clock in the living room echoed like a cannon. Every creak in the floorboards reminded me he was gone. I tried, for a while, to stay strong. I attended church, baked too many pies, even started volunteering at the library, but at night. I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at an empty chair. I was lonely. I was tired. And I was scared. So when my son Matthew called and said, "Mom, just come stay with us for a while. We've got plenty of room," I said yes without thinking twice. It felt like a lifeline. But what I didn't realize was that stepping into my son's house would mean stepping into a world where I was no longer the mother, the center of the home, but an afterthought, an inconvenience, or worse, free labor. Hi, my name is Linda, and this is the story of how I moved in with my son after losing my husband, only to realize his wife saw me as nothing more than a maid. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. When I first arrived at their house, I tried to stay upbeat. I brought Matthew's favorite cookies, offered to make dinner the first night, and even let their dog sleep on my feet. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, greeted me with what I assumed was a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let me show you your room," she said, brisk and businesslike. It was the guest room, of course, a small space with floral curtains and a twin bed. I didn't mind. I wasn't here for luxury. I was here for family. The first few days went smoothly enough. I helped with dishes, folded a bit of laundry, and offered to pick up groceries while Vanessa was at work. "Oh, you don't have to do that," she'd say, but I could tell she didn't mean it. The sigh of relief when I vacuumed the living room, the way she stopped doing the morning dishes, the subtle way tasks began to slide my way. At first, I didn't mind. Helping felt good. It gave me a purpose again. But then, slowly, it shifted. It wasn't help anymore. It was expectation. One morning, I was sipping my coffee when Vanessa dropped a laundry basket at my feet. "The kids need their uniforms washed by noon," she said, not even looking at me. No please, no thank you, just orders, like I was the hired help, or worse, the invisible help. When I mentioned it to Matthew later that evening, he chuckled and said, "She's just stressed. Don't take it personally, Mom." But I did take it personally, because for the first time in my life, I felt like a burden. Not a guest, not a mother, just someone to clean up messes and stay out of the way. It wasn't just the chores, it was the tone, the cold glances, the way she'd roll her eyes when I offered parenting advice. "Thanks, but we do things a little differently now," she'd say, like I was some relic from the past. I remember one evening I had made a roast Matthew's favorite and set the table nicely. When they came home, Vanessa looked at it and said, "Oh, we were going to order Thai." No apology, no appreciation, just disappointment that I had dared to assume I could cook in her kitchen. That night, I ate alone. They sat in the living room, laughing over takeout containers, while my roast sat untouched on the counter. The days started to blur together. I woke up early, packed the kids' lunches, folded endless laundry, and cooked meals that were often ignored. Vanessa stopped thanking me. Matthew stopped noticing. I started to feel like a ghost in a house I didn't belong to. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone with a friend. "She means well," Vanessa said, "but it's like having a live-in housekeeper who doesn't know when to clock out." That cut me deep, deeper than I expected, because I had given up everything to be here. My home, my space, my privacy, and now I was being reduced to a nuisance, a background character in my own son's life. But I kept going. I told myself it would get better, that maybe grief was making me overly sensitive, that maybe Vanessa just needed time to adjust. Until one day, I found something in the garage that changed everything a dusty box with my name written on it. I opened it and found something I wasn't supposed to see. Inside the box was a folder. I assumed it was just old paperwork, maybe documents I'd left behind from my move. But as I flipped it open, my breath caught. It was a printed email chain between Vanessa and a real estate agent. My name, my old address, property evaluations, potential to renovate and flip for profit. Vanessa had been looking into selling my house, the house I still owned, the house where I had raised Matthew, the house where I had held my husband's hand as he passed away. And the worst part, the emails dated back to before I'd even moved in. That night, I couldn't sleep. My hands shook as I held the papers. I kept asking myself, why? Why would she be so invested in getting rid of that home? Why go behind my back? I confronted Matthew the next day, shaking with anger. He looked confused at first, then guilty. I was going to talk to you about it, he said. Vanessa thought it would help. You weren't using the house, and we're trying to save for a bigger place. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You were going to ask me? You already made plans to sell it. He looked away. We didn't mean any harm, Mom. We thought it'd be easier if you just settled in here. Settled in? I was being erased. My memories, my space, my independence sold off and swept away like I was done living. I realized then that Vanessa didn't just see me as a maid. She saw me as someone past her usefulness. An old woman whose presence was only valuable if it could be converted into convenience or cash. And Matthew, me, sweet, oblivious boy, was too caught up in keeping peace to realize what he was allowing to happen. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pack my bags and leave right then. But where would I go? My house wasn't even on the market yet, but the message was loud and clear. I was no longer welcome. Not really. I started paying more attention after that, the way Vanessa would tense when I entered the room, the little digs at my old-fashioned ways. One morning, I heard her telling my granddaughter to not bother Grandma, she's tired. I wasn't tired, I was being pushed aside. Then came the final blow. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Vanessa had friends over. I offered to help set the table. She looked at me and said, "Actually, would you mind just staying upstairs? It's kind of a grown-up's night." A grown-up's night. I wasn't a child. I was the one who had raised her husband, paid for their wedding, offered them this home when they were newlyweds and broke. Now, I was being told to hide away like an embarrassing guest. That evening, I sat in my room staring at the walls. I thought about my husband, what he would have said, how he would have stood up for me. I cried, not because of the words, but because I felt erased. Like my presence in this family had gone from being foundational to being unwanted. And as I looked out the window, watching the party downstairs, something in me hardened. If they wanted a maid, I'd give them something else entirely. I would stop being quiet. I would stop being accommodating. I wasn't done living, and I certainly wasn't going to let someone else decide what to do with my life or my legacy. The next morning, I made a phone call. I didn't tell Matthew. I didn't tell Vanessa. I called a lawyer, and I started digging deeper into the emails, the paperwork, the property rights. If they wanted a battle, they were going to get one. The lawyer I met was younger than I expected, early 30s, sharp suit and even sharper eyes. Her name was Rachel Moore, and from the moment I stepped into her office, I knew I was in good hands. She didn't look at me like a confused old woman. She listened carefully, patiently. I laid out everything: the emails, the attitude shift, the subtle exclusion, and most of all, the attempted sale of my home behind my back. When I finished, she sat back and said, "Legally, they don't have a leg to stand on if the property is solely in your name. But this isn't just about legality, is it?" I nodded, feeling tears sting my eyes. "It's about not being discarded," I said quietly. She nodded. "Let's make sure that message is heard, loud and clear." That night, I returned home and tried to act normal, but something in me had shifted. I was no longer just someone living under their roof. I was watching, documenting, preparing. I started keeping a journal of everything: dates, comments, moments of exclusion. Not because I planned to use it all in court, but because I needed to remind myself I wasn't imagining things. This was real, and I wasn't crazy. A few days later, I overheard Vanessa on the phone. "She's going to make things harder than I thought," she said, voice low but tense. "We might have to be more direct." More direct? About what? I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I started reclaiming small things. I stopped doing all the laundry. I didn't clean up their dishes after dinner. I began politely declining Vanessa's requests with a smile and a simple, "I'm not feeling up to it today." It drove her mad. One morning, she left a note on the kitchen counter. "If you're not going to contribute, maybe it's time to rethink this arrangement." I took a photo of it. That same afternoon, I had a long talk with Matthew. I didn't show him the note, not yet. I simply asked him, "Do you think I belong here?" He looked at me, caught off guard. "Of course, Mom. Why would you ask that?" I just smiled and said, "Then maybe we should talk about what belonging really looks like." But the final crack came a week later. I came downstairs to find Vanessa speaking with a realtor in my living room. She was walking them through the space, talking about potential upgrades and investment opportunities. I didn't wait. I walked straight into the room, looked the realtor in the eye, and said, "This house is not for sale, and she doesn't own it." The silence was electric. Vanessa looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. The realtor blinked. "I'm sorry. I wasn't aware." "You are now," I said, and walked out. That night, Vanessa exploded. "You embarrassed me in front of a professional contact," she shouted. "You're ruining everything." Matthew stood frozen, torn between us. I stayed calm. "You tried to sell my house. You've treated me like an unpaid servant since I walked in here. I am not ruining anything. I'm reclaiming myself." Vanessa turned to Matthew. "Do something." He looked at me and then back at her. Maybe we need to take a break from this whole setup," he said, barely above a whisper. Vanessa stormed upstairs, and I realized maybe Matthew wasn't lost. Maybe he was just scared. But scared or not, the truth was finally coming into the light. I wasn't going to shrink back into silence. I had a voice. I had rights. And I had a story that needed telling, not just for me, but for every woman who had ever been pushed aside the moment she stopped being useful. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake in the guest bed, now staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled thuds of Vanessa pacing upstairs. I could feel the tension in the walls, thick and sour like spoiled milk. But beneath that discomfort, there was a strange calm in me, too. I had drawn a line, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel small. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. No passive-aggressive remarks from Vanessa, no strained attempts at normalcy, just silence. Matthew had already left for work, and I could hear the kids whispering to each other upstairs, unsure if they were allowed to come down. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, sipping slowly, reclaiming the space inch by inch. Around noon, Vanessa appeared. Her hair was perfect, her lipstick flawless, but her eyes looked tired. "We need to talk," she said flatly. I nodded, and she sat across from me. "I didn't mean for things to get so tense," she began. I said nothing, just listened. "I've been under a lot of pressure with the job, the kids, and now this economy. Having another person in the house, it changed things." I raised an eyebrow. "Changed what exactly? The fact that your husband's mother is grieving and needed support?" She flinched at that. "It's not that I don't care," she said. "It's just you being here shifted everything, and I guess I handled that badly." I waited a beat before responding. "Vanessa, I'm not here to raise your children. I'm not here to clean your house or be an unpaid nanny. I came here because I lost my husband, because I thought my son would be my anchor in that storm. But instead, I became invisible in a house I helped pay for, in a life I helped build." She looked down, and then I asked her something I hadn't dared ask until now. "What were you hoping would happen if I'd signed those papers?" Her head snapped up. "You knew?" I nodded. "I read the fine print. You wanted me to co-sign a refinance that would shift the deed into both your names. You thought I wouldn't notice?" She didn't deny it. She just whispered, "We needed equity to stay afloat." "So you thought I'd just hand over my house?" I asked. "Without a conversation?" Her silence was louder than any answer. That night, Matthew came home and asked to talk. We sat in the backyard, the sun dipping low behind the fence, the air thick with unspoken words. "I don't know how things got this far," he said, "but I never wanted you to feel like a burden." I looked at him. "My son, the boy who used to pick dandelions and call them sunflowers just to see me smile. You didn't make me feel like a burden," I said. "You let someone else do it, and you stayed quiet." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry." We sat there for a long time, listening to the crickets and distant traffic, and then he said something I didn't expect. "Maybe it's time you had your own place again. Somewhere close. Somewhere yours." At first, I felt the sting of rejection, but then I realized what he was really offering: autonomy, respect, a chance to rebuild. "I think you're right," I said softly. The next few weeks were a blur. With the lawyer's help, I reversed the paperwork, protected my assets, and found a small apartment about 10 minutes away. It wasn't big, but it had light and space and silence that didn't feel like punishment. I furnished it myself, picked the curtains, planted herbs on the windowsill. It was mine. Vanessa didn't come to help, and that was fine. But Matthew did. He carried boxes, hung pictures, even built the bookshelf I'd been dreaming of. One evening, as we sipped tea in my new kitchen, he said, "This feels better." And I smiled. "It does." But the most unexpected thing happened 2 weeks after I moved in. A woman knocked on my door, late 50s, gray streaks in her curls, wearing a cardigan that smelled like lavender. "Are you Emma?" she asked. I nodded. "I saw your story on the local forum about what happened. I've been through something similar. Do you want to get coffee sometime?" I looked at her and felt something open in me. A doorway I hadn't realized was still shut. "I'd like that," I said. And just like that, I wasn't alone anymore. That night, I lay awake in the small guest room, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me like the hands of a clock I couldn't control. I'd spent weeks convincing myself I could adapt, that maybe Melissa just needed time, that the awkward tension between us would ease into something warmer. But I couldn't ignore the facts anymore. I wasn't living with my son and his wife. I was being absorbed into their household like unpaid staff. I did the laundry, I mopped the floors, I cooked dinner 5 nights a week, and on the sixth, Melissa treated me to take out, which I still had to go pick up. I hadn't asked for special treatment. I hadn't expected foot rubs or fresh flowers on my nightstand, but I had expected kindness, acknowledgement, respect. That morning, I overheard Melissa on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice was sharp, fast. No, she's still here. No idea when she plans to leave. David won't bring it up, so I have to keep smiling and pretending this is normal. My heart sank. I stopped short in the hallway, frozen. I didn't need to hear more. I tiptoed back into my room and closed the door slowly, quietly, as if not making noise would make her words less real. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. These same hands had bandaged David's scraped knees, sewn buttons on his little shirts, held his during doctor visits and heartbreaks, and now I was an inconvenience, an obstacle in my own son's home. But I wasn't just feeling sorry for myself. I was starting to notice things that didn't add up, like how the guest room closet had been completely emptied before I moved in. Or how Melissa always changed the subject when David asked about her job, brushing him off with vague answers and a kiss on the cheek. Or how the mail was never delivered to the house directly. Melissa picked it up at a P.O. box every week. It wasn't just that she didn't want me there. It was like she didn't want anyone seeing too much. Then one afternoon, while folding laundry, I found a receipt tucked into the pocket of David's jeans. It wasn't for groceries or gas, it was for a hotel. A single night, just 2 towns over, dated 3 weeks ago. My hands trembled. I placed the jeans on the bed and sat down, the receipt still clutched between my fingers. Had he gone somewhere to clear his head? Was there someone else, or was this Melissa's doing? That evening at dinner, I asked carefully, David, were you out of town a few weeks ago? He looked up from his plate. No, why? I hesitated. Oh, just something I overheard on the news about road closures. Thought maybe you'd been affected. Melissa glanced at me, then at David, her fork pausing midair. I pretended not to notice, but her eyes lingered on me a second too long. The next morning, David left early for a meeting. Melissa was in the kitchen, sipping her smoothie and scrolling through her phone. I sat down across from her. Can we talk? She didn't look up. Sure. I took a breath. I know I've overstayed. I know this situation isn't what anyone expected, but I need to know something. Are you hiding something from my son? Her eyes snapped up to meet mine. For a brief moment, I saw something flicker shock, guilt, contempt. Excuse me? She said, her voice flat. I've seen the way you dodge his questions, the secrecy, the tension. If something's going on, he deserves to know. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. You think you can walk in here and play detective? You don't know the first thing about our marriage. This isn't your house, and he's not your little boy anymore. I swallowed hard. He may be your husband now, but he's still my son. And if you're hurting him, don't finish that sentence, she snapped, standing up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the tile. You want to stay out of a motel? Then keep your nose out of things you don't understand. She stormed off, leaving her half-finished smoothie on the table. My hands were shaking, but I felt a strange surge of clarity. Whatever was happening, I was getting close to the truth. And Melissa knew it. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have imagined, was just how deep the secret went. The tension after that morning hung thick in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Melissa barely looked at me for days. David noticed, of course, and asked if everything was all right. I lied. I smiled and said it was just women adjusting to the household. He laughed softly, kissed my forehead, and thanked me for being so patient with her. That nearly broke me. I wasn't being patient. I was being dismissed, invisible, but I wasn't about to start a war without proof. And I still didn't know what I was really dealing with until the day I opened the wrong drawer. It happened while I was dusting the living room. Melissa had gone out for groceries. David was at work. I bent to pick up a photo frame that had slipped off the shelf, and when I stood back up, I noticed the small desk tucked into the corner of Melissa's workspace. I'd never touched it before, but this time something compelled me. The top drawer was slightly ajar. I pulled it open and saw a few envelopes, receipts, a flash drive. Then I noticed a thick envelope with David's name on it. Curious, I peeked inside. It was a bank statement, not their sheets, and the balances didn't make sense. Withdrawals for things I'd never heard him mention. Frequent ATM activity in towns far from here. And, most alarmingly, a $30,000 transfer labeled Private Account MJW, Melissa Jane Whitaker. My heart dropped. That was her maiden name. I closed the drawer, replaced everything as I found it, and sat down with my hands clenched tight. I wasn't crazy. Something was very wrong. That night, I waited until David was alone. "Honey," I said gently, "do you and Melissa have a joint account?" He looked surprised. "No, we keep our finances mostly separate." "Why?" I hesitated, but I couldn't lie anymore. I think she might be taking money from your account." He blinked, then chuckled uncomfortably. "Mom, that's a serious accusation." "I know it is, and I wouldn't say it without reason." He shook his head. "You've never liked her." "That's not true. I've tried, but I can't ignore what I've seen." I wanted to scream, but instead I just handed him the envelope I'd slipped into my cardigan pocket before dinner. He opened it, skimmed the statements, and I watched his face change. From confusion to disbelief, then to something darker, betrayal. This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "She told me these withdrawals were for student loans, but she said they were paid off years ago." He trailed off. I stayed quiet, let him sit with it. He didn't speak to Melissa that night. He didn't speak much at all. The next morning, he left early, again earlier than usual. Melissa paced the kitchen when she realized he hadn't told her where he was going. She saw me and narrowed her eyes. "What did you say to him?" I just looked at her, calm, still. I gave him the truth. What he does with it is his choice. She laughed sharp, humorless. "You think you've won something? You think he'll throw me out and beg you to stay? You have no idea who you're dealing with." And then she did something I didn't expect. She sat down, buried her head in her hands, and said, "I never meant for this to happen. It started small, one transfer, one lie, then it kept going, and now it's all tangled up." I didn't know how to stop. It was the first time she'd shown anything resembling remorse, but I didn't know if I believed her. Was this real regret, or just panic that she'd been caught? Later that evening, David came home. His expression was unreadable. He asked Melissa to sit with him in the living room. I stayed in the hallway, close enough to hear. "I went to the bank," he said flatly. "They confirmed everything. The accounts, the transfers, even the forged signatures." Melissa didn't deny it. "I'm not pressing charges," David said. "But you're leaving tonight," she cried. Begged, swore she'd change, but it was too late. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired, hollow. This wasn't the outcome I wanted. I never wanted my son to live through betrayal like this. But it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. because what came next would change everything for all of us. The house was quiet that night, unnaturally quiet. Melissa had left with 2 suitcases and a tear-streaked face, her sobs echoing faintly as the taxi pulled away. David stood by the window long after she was gone. I didn't ask if he was okay. I already knew he wasn't. And neither was I. Losing a spouse is one kind of grief. But this was a grief of betrayal, twisted, confusing, without closure. The woman he loved had stolen from him, lied to him, used his trust like currency. And Ahi's mother had become both the messenger and the witness to his heartbreak. Over the next few days, we moved around each other like ghosts. He'd go to work early, return late, eat quietly. I cleaned less, cooked less, said little. Not because I was upset, but because I wanted to give him space to unravel it all. One night, while folding laundry, he sat beside me on the couch. "How long did you know?" he asked, voice flat. I looked down at the towel in my hands. Long enough to feel guilty about not saying anything sooner, but not long enough to stop it before it got worse. He nodded slowly. "I feel stupid." I reached out and placed my hand on his. "You trusted her. That's not stupid. That's love. What she did with that trust, that's on her, not you." That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept through the night. But something strange started happening not long after Melissa left. A few envelopes arrived in the mail, no name, no return address, just a P.O. box and a cryptic sender ID. At first, I assumed they were old bills, maybe lingering bank notifications in her name. But when I opened the third one, my hands froze. Inside was a single page, a photograph of Melissa, sitting at a cafe, holding hands with a man I didn't recognize, date stamped 3 months before she married David. Attached was a note, typed in capital letters, "You don't know the whole story." I showed it to David the next morning. He stared at it for a long time before simply whispering, "Who sent this?" Neither of us had an answer. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one, thicker, inside, printed emails, hundreds of them, between Melissa and a man named Anthony. Messages that went back years before the wedding, during the engagement, even while she and David were apartment hunting. I didn't read them all, but the tone was clear, romantic, deceitful, ongoing. "He's clueless," one email read. "I'll keep pulling money as long as I can." My stomach turned. David sat across from me, reading every line, his face blank. At one point, he stopped and asked, "Why would someone send us this?" I didn't know, but whoever it was, they clearly knew a lot. Too much. Later that day, David did something unexpected. He called Melissa, not to scream, not to confront, but to ask flatly, "Who is Anthony?" There was silence on the line. Then Melissa said, "You shouldn't be talking to me." Click, she hung up. That answer was an answer in itself. That evening, David asked me to help him search through the old laptop Melissa had left behind. It was locked, of course, but David remembered her passcode, her cat's birthday. I watched as folder after folder opened. Photos, documents, voice notes. Hidden within a subfolder labeled taxes was a PDF titled Instructions, and in it, a detailed plan. Withdrawals, account timing, even a mock email thread drafted in his name. It was a blueprint for financial and emotional manipulation. David leaned back in his chair, pale. "She planned this," he muttered. "She planned everything." I didn't speak. What was there to say? But that night, As he sat in his room, door cracked open just slightly, I could hear soft sobs, the kind of crying a grown man does when he realizes he built his life with someone who never really loved him. And as a mother, that sound hurt more than anything Melissa ever said to me. Yet even through all of this, something in me still didn't feel settled. I had a gut feeling that whoever was sending us this information wasn't doing it out of kindness. It felt strategic, like they wanted something, like this was just the beginning. And I was right. Because a week later, a woman knocked on our front door. She looked to be in her late 40s, blonde, stern, confident. She introduced herself simply. My name is Vanessa. I'm Anthony's ex-wife. Vanessa stood in our doorway with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. Her eyes scanned the living room behind me, not rudely but knowingly. Like she had imagined this moment long before arriving. I opened the door wider and invited her in, unsure whether I was making a mistake, but my instincts told me this woman wasn't here to harm. David joined us in the kitchen, his expression guarded. Vanessa didn't waste time. I know about the emails, she said. I sent them. David blinked. Why? She sighed and sat down at our table like she belonged there. Because I wanted you to know who Melissa really is, or at least who she's been with my ex-husband. My heart stopped. Anthony, I said. She nodded. They've been together for years, on and off, mostly on. David swallowed hard. So he's real. And she's been using me? Vanessa didn't sugarcoat it. They target men like you, trusting, successful. She gets close, digs into the finances, and he launders the rest. They've done this before. My hands trembled. How do you know all this? She pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. Inside were court transcripts, police reports, even mug shots, Anthony's, not Melissa's, charges, wire fraud, identity theft, coercion. But he had always walked on technicalities. Vanessa had spent 5 years married to him before finally escaping the web. Melissa is smarter, she added. She stays clean on paper, but I've seen the messages. I've lived this nightmare. David leaned back, pale. How did you find us? Vanessa smiled wryly. I didn't. Melissa used the same aliases, the same bank routing paths. I track her, in a way. I told myself I was done caring, but when I found out she got married again, to someone who looked so much like my brother, I couldn't stay silent. For the next hour, we sat around the table connecting dots we didn't know existed. Vanessa explained how Melissa and Anthony ran soft schemes, nothing dramatic enough to make the news, but enough to leave men devastated and bankrupt. She never stays long, Vanessa said. 18 months is the average. David's voice was low. We were married 16. Vanessa nodded. And if I hadn't sent those emails, she probably would have taken your pension next. There was silence, thick, paralyzing. David eventually excused himself and went for a walk. I stayed with Vanessa, and for the first time, I felt like I was speaking with someone who truly understood not just the betrayal, but the shame. The silent guilt that comes from being fooled by someone you welcomed into your home, your family. Before she left, Vanessa looked me in the eye and said, "Don't let this define you. Don't let her turn you into a footnote in her story. You deserve to be the narrator." That night, I found David sitting on the porch, staring at the stars like they owed him answers. "Do you think she ever loved me?" he asked, voice raw. I sat beside him. "I think she loved the idea of you, the comfort, the access. But love, real love doesn't calculate return on investment." He nodded slowly, tears quietly slipping down his cheeks. "I feel so foolish." I squeezed his hand. "You're not. You're human. And you're healing." We decided not to respond to Melissa's last few texts. They became more frantic, more manipulative. At one point she wrote, You'll regret listening to your mother. That one stung. But not in the way she intended. It reminded me that for once I had chosen to speak up, not stay silent, and David had chosen to listen. Over the following weeks, we started to rebuild not just routines, but trust. Trust in ourselves, trust in family. I no longer felt like a maid, I felt like a mother again. I cooked because I wanted to, cleaned because it brought me peace, and David stopped expecting it. Instead, he'd ask if I wanted to go for walks, see a movie, just sit and talk. One day, out of nowhere, he said, "Mom, I'm really glad you came to live with me, even if it started the way it did." I smiled. Me too. But we weren't done with Melissa, not yet, because 2 weeks later we were served. A civil notice. Melissa was suing for emotional distress, reputational damage, and slander. She claimed the emails were fabricated, the narrative false, and that I had coerced David into sabotaging the marriage. I stared at the papers in disbelief, and that's when I knew this wasn't just a betrayal anymore. It was war. The lawsuit felt like a punch in the chest. I held the envelope in my hands for minutes before I could even bring myself to open it. My name was there, clear as day, alongside a list of allegations so absurd I had to read them twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Melissa accused me of manipulation, emotional sabotage, invasion of privacy, and defamation. She even cited the emails as evidence of a targeted smear campaign orchestrated by me and a jealous woman from her husband's past. It was laughable if it hadn't been so dangerous. Because lawsuits, no matter how baseless, cost money, time, and peace of mind, and Melissa knew that. David was furious. She's weaponizing the system now. She's trying to scare us into silence. But fear wasn't the emotion burning inside me anymore. It was resolve. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and erased for months, first as a widow, then as a burden, and finally as a target. Not anymore. I found a lawyer who specialized in family coercion and elder abuse cases. Her name was Janice, and from the first meeting, she made me feel like I had armor. We gathered everything: the emails, the photographs, the witness accounts, including Vanessa, who agreed to testify. I even included copies of receipts and texts Melissa had sent me over the last year's mall, things that, in isolation, meant nothing. But together, they painted a picture. The case gained attention, not because we wanted it to, but because these kinds of stories rarely made it to court. A mother being sued by her former daughter-in-law for breaking up the marriage after uncovering a long con. It had all the drama of a courtroom thriller, but it was my life. A local journalist reached out. I hesitated at first, but Janice encouraged me. Tell your story before she gets to spin hers. So I did. The article ran under the title, "From Grief to Battle, A Widow's Fight Against Family Betrayal." I didn't name Melissa. I didn't have to. The facts stood on their own. And once again, my inbox began to flood, only this time it wasn't just women. It was sons, daughters, even grandparents, all sharing stories of quiet manipulation, veiled abuse, and the way love can be weaponized. The community rallied. We weren't alone. David and I spoke at a local support event for families dealing with coercion and financial exploitation. People hugged us, cried with us. One woman said, "You made me feel seen for the first time in years." And slowly, the narrative shifted. I wasn't just a mother who moved in with her son. I was a woman who had survived heartbreak, deception, and war inside her own home and chosen not to go quietly. As the court date approached, Melissa's tone changed. Her lawyer began pushing for a settlement. She offered to drop the charges if I signed a non-disclosure agreement and agreed not to publicly disparage her again. But I had learned silence was a cage, not a compromise. I looked Janice in the eye and said, we go all the way. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, but the tension inside was thick enough to suffocate. Melissa sat across from me, pristine as ever, flanked by a team of attorneys. She didn't look at me once, but David did. He sat behind me the entire time, his hand on my shoulder. Vanessa testified with grace and clarity. Janice was brilliant, measured, sharp, and deeply human in her arguments. When it was my turn to speak, I stood tall. My voice didn't shake. I came to live with my son after my husband passed. I didn't come to dismantle his life. I came to survive my own. What happened inside that home, what Melissa did to me and to Davidus, not fiction, it's fact. And I won't apologize for telling the truth. The judge didn't deliver a verdict that day. These things take time. But as I walked out of that courtroom, something inside me had already shifted. For the first time in over a year, I felt free. 3 weeks after the hearing, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address, just my name and a handwriting I recognized instantly, Melissa's. Inside was a single folded sheet. No legal jargon this time, no threats, just a few shaky lines of ink. I lost everything. And maybe I deserved to. I thought I was protecting my life, my home, my family. But I see now I was only protecting the lie. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I read it once, then again, then folded it up and placed it in a box labeled past. That's where it belongs. The court ruled in our favor. Every charge Melissa filed was dismissed. The judge's final remarks stayed with me. This wasn't just a dispute. It was a lesson in truth, in courage, and in how we treat the people who raise us. Today, I live in a warm little home just outside Portland. My garden is small but full of color. I bake on Sundays. I joined a community book club, and we laugh more than we read. David visits weekly. We talk, really talk now. No more walking on eggshells. Just two people trying to rebuild something honest, one Sunday afternoon at a time. Do I miss my husband? Every day. Do I wish things had gone differently? Of course. But I've also learned this. Heartbreak can be a beginning. If you let it, pain can be a doorway, not to bitterness, but to strength, to self-respect, to peace. I didn't move in with my son to be anyone's maid. I moved in because I was broken, and I came out whole. So if you've been made to feel like you're too much or in the way, if someone has tried to shrink your worth because of your age or your presence, please remember, you matter. You are not a burden, and you deserve to be seen, heard, and honored. And now, I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments what you thought of my story. I read every single one, and if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It truly helps more than you know. Because our stories deserve to be told, and you never know who might need to hear yours next.